The estate is quiet. It is always quiet. This place built for men who needed to hear themselves think, and women who were expected not to disturb them. Lila has been standing outside the study for 3 minutes, her hand raised to knock, frozen by the sound on the other side of the door. Dorian Vale is laughing. She has not heard him laugh in 3 months. Not once. The sound is low and genuine, the laugh of a man who is comfortable, not performing, and it hits her chest like something being rearranged. Then she hears Cashion's voice, teasing familiar. And then she hears her name. She does not hear everything. She hears enough. She lowers her hand. She walks back down the corridor. She does not run. In her room, she stands in front of the wardrobe for a long time. The gowns Dorian chose. The jewels that arrived with a note she has since memorized because it was the most personal thing he has ever written to her. She leaves all of it. She takes nothing from a life that was never really hers. By the time the first gray light touches the estate's cobblestone drive, Lila Carrington is already gone. Quick pause, comment where you're watching from, and if you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. I've got a lot more coming. Chapter 1. She had prepared herself for coldness. That part, she had rehearsed on the long carriage ride, the hours of clipped countryside rolling past her window while she sat with her hands folded and her face arranged into something she hoped resembled composure. She had told herself, it will be a transaction dressed in courtesy. There will be rooms and schedules and formal dinners where no one says anything true. She would endure it the way she had endured everything else in her life, with the particular quiet dignity of a woman who had learned early that the world did not reward women who made scenes. What Lila Carrington had not prepared herself for was the way Vale House would feel like grief. She understood, stepping down from the carriage onto the cobblestone drive, that she had been expecting something ugly she could resent. A crumbling ancestral pile with drafty corridors and the smell of damp stone and old ambition. Something that would make leaving eventually feel like relief. Instead, the estate rose against the late afternoon sky in pale limestone and dark ivy, its windows warm with interior light, its grounds stretching away into a formal garden that bled, at its furthest edges, into untamed woodland. It was beautiful, not the calculated beauty of a showpiece, but the settled, unself-conscious beauty of a place that had been lived in for centuries by people who believed they belonged here. She did not belong here. That understanding arrived quietly, without drama, and took up residence somewhere in her sternum. The housekeeper, a compact woman named Mrs. Holt with watchful eyes and the manner of someone who had seen arrangements like this come and go, showed her through the entrance hall without ceremony. There were staff, formally arranged in a line that felt more like an inspection than a welcome. There was a footman who took her single traveling case with the expression of a man diplomatically concealing surprise at its modest weight. There were flowers, white, stiff, impeccable, in a tall vase on a side table that had probably cost more than her father's entire drawing room. And there was Dorian Vale. She did not see him immediately. She was being introduced to the head groundskeeper when she became aware of him, a shift in the quality of the room's attention, the way the assembled staff seemed to subtly recalibrate, not from nerves but from habit. She turned, and there he was. He was standing at the far end of the entrance hall near the staircase, not approaching, not greeting her, simply watching. Dark hair, pulled back from a face that was all clean angles and careful stillness. He wore all black, fitted shirt, dark trousers, a leather belt buckle that caught the light when he moved slightly to lean one shoulder against the doorframe. His hands were in his pockets. His expression was unreadable in the way that expressions only become when someone has spent years making them so. He looked at her for a moment, long enough to be deliberate, not long enough to be warmth, and then he looked away. That was it. That was the entirety of Dorian Vale's acknowledgement of the woman who had arrived to become part of his household. A look, and then the withholding of a look. Lila turned back to the groundskeeper and asked a polite question about the garden. She found a note on her desk that evening. It was written in a hand that surprised her. Not the clipped scrawl of a man who considered correspondence a burden, but something more considered than that. Structured, controlled, the letters closely spaced as though he'd been thinking carefully between each one. She read it standing up, still in her traveling clothes. Welcome to Vale House. Supper is at 8.
Divvy.
That was all. She read it 4 times. She could not have explained why. There was nothing in it to read, nothing beneath the surface to decode. It was a functional sentence dressed in the clothes of a welcome. And yet she stood there reading it 4 times, her finger tracing the edge of the paper, noting that he had not written the full word dinner.
Supper.
It was a smaller word, a more domestic word, the kind of word you used for a meal in a house where you actually lived rather than presided. She set it face down on the desk. She told herself this meant nothing. She went to change for supper. The meal itself was what she had expected, formally laid, beautifully prepared, and almost entirely silent. Dorian sat at the head of the table, and she sat to his right, and between them stretched approximately 3 feet of white linen and the absolute understanding that neither of them was going to be the one who made this easy. He spoke to the footman. He spoke, once, about a matter involving the estate's northern boundary to a steward who appeared briefly in the doorway. He offered her wine with a gesture toward the decanter that was entirely without words, and she noticed that when she declined, he did not insist or question or look at her sideways the way people sometimes did when women at formal tables declined wine. He simply moved on, as though her choice was hers to make, without explanation. It was the first thing he did that she filed away. Not because it was remarkable, it shouldn't be remarkable, but because it was the first thing he had done that suggested he understood something about occupying a room with another person, that their preferences were theirs. She ate her meal. She answered when spoken to. She watched him from beneath her lashes the way she had trained herself to do in rooms where she needed to understand the temperature without seeming to take it. He was watching her too. She was nearly certain of it. Not obviously. Not the way Cashion, who arrived for the final course with the easy familiarity of a man at home in this house, was watching her with open and cheerful assessment. Dorian's attention, when it landed, was different. It had weight. It lingered on her hands when she reached for her glass, on the line of her jaw when she turned to respond to something, on the untouched bread roll beside her plate that she had broken apart absently and never eaten. She didn't know what to do with that. So she did nothing with it, which was her answer to most things. After supper, she walked. She had always needed to walk after difficult things, not to escape but to metabolize, to let her body process what her mind was still working through. The estate's lower corridor led to a door that opened onto the south garden, and she found herself in the cool evening air with the smell of turned earth and night-blooming jasmine and the far, muffled sound of the woodland beyond the wall. It was, she noted, extraordinarily beautiful. She hated that it was beautiful. It would have been easier, she thought, to be unhappy somewhere ugly. She was standing near the garden wall, her hand on the cold stone, looking up at the dark shape of the woodland against a sky beginning to show its first stars, when she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't turn. "You'll find the east gate unlocked," said a voice. Dorian's voice, which she had heard so little of that its particular quality, low, not unkind, careful, still registered as new information. If you prefer to walk further.
She turned then.
He was standing a few yards back, not approaching, coat on now against the evening chill. He had his hands in his pockets again. He was looking at her with the same unreadable expression, and she thought, he came out here after me. He followed me out here, and he is pretending he didn't.
Thank you, she said.
He nodded. He was about to go. She could see it in the slight shift of his weight, and something moved in her, some reckless instinct, and she said, "Did you choose the flowers in the entrance hall? The white ones?" He went still. It was a strange question, and they both knew it. Then, no. Mrs. Holt has managed the house's arrangements for 20 years. I've never interfered with them. They were beautiful, Lila said. I wasn't criticizing. I was going to say they chose something that suits the light in there. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't parse. Then he said carefully, "I'll tell her you said so." He went inside. She stood in the garden for another 20 minutes, the stars coming out one by one above the stone wall, the night cooling around her. She did not know, standing there, that this would be the closest she would come to real conversation with him for the next 11 weeks. In the weeks that followed, Lila built a life from the materials available to her. She learned the rhythms of the house, breakfast at 7, which Dorian rarely attended, the mid-morning arrival of correspondence that transformed a study into a closed door for hours, the afternoon quiet when the staff moved through the upper corridors like thoughts through a sleeping mind. She found the library, 3 rooms deep, a serious library, the kind that suggested generations of people had actually read these books rather than arranged them for effect, and she began spending her mornings there, working her way through histories and letters and one extraordinary volume of botanical illustrations she discovered wedged between 2 heavy law texts. She did not seek Dorian out. She had understood, without it being said, that this was the arrangement, proximity without intrusion. She had her rooms, her routines, her corner of the library. He had his study, his correspondence, the parts of the estate she was quietly not invited into. It was a map drawn in silence, and she followed it because she understood what happened when you pushed at maps you hadn't drawn yourself. But she watched him. She couldn't help watching him. He was not cruel. She had prepared herself for cruelty. The grinding kind, the kind that wears you down not through single acts, but through accumulated small dismissals, through the 1,000 daily ways a person can make you feel like furniture in their own home.
He was not that.
He was simply absent. Not physically. She saw him often enough, passing in corridors, at the dinner table 3 evenings a week, occasionally in the garden where he walked alone in the very early morning with the focused energy of a man working something through. He was physically present. He was simply not there in the way that mattered, not reaching, not curious, not willing to close any of the 1,000 small distances between them. She watched him with the cook one morning and saw something that confused her. He had come downstairs earlier than usual, and she had been just inside the kitchen doorway when he appeared, and the cook, a woman named Agnes, who was 70 if she was a day and had the moral authority of an elderly general, told him flatly that he looked terrible and had he slept at all, and Dorian Vale, who had looked through most of the estate staff like they were weather, laughed. Not politely. Actually laughed, and said something low that made Agnes shake her head with the fond exasperation of someone who had known him since boyhood. The man she saw in that kitchen doorway for 30 seconds was a completely different person than the man who sat across from her at formal dinners. That was the day she understood something important. His distance from her was not his natural state. It was a performance. And the question she told herself not to care about and then spent the next 4 weeks quietly caring about, was why. Why specifically for her? She did not find the answer before everything fell apart. But she filed it away, the way she filed everything about him away, in the careful archive of a woman who has been told all her life that her observations are not important, and has therefore learned to keep them somewhere private and precise and entirely her own. She filed it away, and she waited, and she learned the estate's silences like a language. She would, later, wish she had asked the question out loud before it was too late. Chapter 2. He had not expected to notice her this much. That was the inconvenient truth Dorian Vale turned over in the early mornings when the estate was still and the study fire had burned down to orange coals and there was nothing left to occupy his hands or his mind. He had expected the arrangement to settle into the background of his life like all the other arrangements, the ones that arrived with formal language and left without ceremony, fulfilling their purpose with the polite efficiency of a business transaction concluded between people who respected each other without particularly liking one another. He had not expected Lila Carrington. Not her specifically. Not the way she moved through his house, as though she were trying to take up as little space as possible, her shoulders pulled slightly inward, her voice calibrated to never require anyone to lean toward her. Not the particular quality of her attention, the way she listened to people with her whole face, not performing interest but actually present, actually receiving what was being said. Not the way she had looked at him across the dinner table on her third evening, and he had caught it, just for a second, and the look had not been longing or resentment or the careful blankness of a woman playing a role. It had been curiosity. Direct, unembellished, the curiosity of someone who genuinely wanted to understand a thing. He had looked away before she could see him looking. That was the pattern he had established in the first 2 weeks and had been rigidly maintaining since. He looked when she was not looking, and he was looking elsewhere by the time she turned. It was an absurd performance, and he knew it was absurd, and he continued it because the alternative was allowing her to catch him being interested in her, and he could not, for reasons he had not yet fully examined, permit that. Cashion noticed. Of course Cashion noticed. Cashion noticed everything. It was what made him invaluable as an advisor and occasionally exhausting as a friend. "She's more composed than I expected," Cashion said one morning, appearing in the study doorway with the ease of a man who had never learned to knock. He dropped into the chair across the desk with the casual authority of someone who had been doing so since they were boys. "Given the circumstances." Said Dorian, not looking up from the correspondence in front of him. "Hasn't complained once. Hasn't asked for anything. The staff are warming to her. Agnes apparently adores her, which, as you know, is not given lightly." A pause. "She found the botanical library." Dorian looked up at that. He had not known she'd found it. The 3 small rooms at the back of the east wing that contained his grandmother's collection, which he'd kept because he could not bring himself to have it catalogued and dispersed even though he'd never touched it himself. She mentioned it? Agnes mentioned it. Said she's been spending her mornings there. Reading the letters, apparently. Your grandmother's correspondence with the Royal Botanical Society. Cashion tilted his head. "Did you know she speaks some French? Apparently, there are letters she's been translating. For pleasure." Dorian looked back down at his papers. "She's not what I'd have expected you to choose," Cashion said, his tone shifting just slightly. A quality change, something more careful. "For an arrangement." "I didn't choose her," Dorian said. "The families." "Right," said Cashion. "Of course." But something in his voice, very slightly, did not sound like "of course." It sounded like a note being filed away. The botanical rooms had 3 tall windows on the south face, and in the mornings they caught the light in a way that turned everything golden. Dorian knew this because he had been in those rooms exactly twice, once at 12, exploring the house with the purposeless energy of a boy given too much space, and once at 31, standing in the doorway with the door half open, watching Lila Carrington sit cross-legged on the floor in a square of morning light with a stack of letters in her lap and her shoes set neatly beside her, and her hair half unpinned from its morning arrangement, one strand falling across her cheek that she was absently tucking behind her ear every few minutes as it fell again. He had stood there for what he later understood was too long. She had not looked up. She was entirely absorbed, reading something that clearly delighted her, the evidence of that delight visible in the small, frequent movements of her expression, a lifted corner of her mouth, a slight narrowing at something precise, a barely audible exhale of a sound that was almost laughter. She was having a private experience of joy in a room she thought was empty, and it was the most unguarded thing he had seen in years, and he felt, with visceral sudden clarity, that he was trespassing on something real. He stepped back. He pulled the door to its original position. He walked back down the corridor with the particular stride of a man who is not hurrying. He spent the rest of the morning at his desk, unable to read the correspondence in front of him. That evening at dinner he asked her, carefully, casually, as though the question had arrived by accident, whether she had found everything she needed in the library. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." A pause, and then, "Your grandmother had extraordinary taste. The letters especially." She was arguing with 3 different botanists simultaneously about the correct classification of a variety of wild rose, and she was right about all 3, and she knew it, and it reads, a very small smile, rather magnificently. "I've never read them," he said. She looked at him then, full, direct. "You should," she said, and there was no judgment in it, only the frank opinion of a person who had just encountered something worth passing on. "They're the most alive thing in this house." He did not know what to say to that. He reached for his wine. The moment passed. He thought about it for the rest of the week. Weeks passed. The estate moved through its rhythms. Autumn deepened the woodland beyond the wall, and the garden turned bronze and gold, and the mornings arrived with a chill that Lila met with a gray wool shawl he noticed she wore like armor, wrapped close, hands tucked inside it, standing at the garden wall staring at the changing trees with an expression he had categorized, in his private taxonomy of her expressions, as thinking about something she wasn't going to say. He had a private taxonomy of her expressions. He was aware this was not the behavior of a man who was indifferent. He was also aware that he had not done a single thing about it, had not closed the distance at dinner by an inch, had not knocked on the botanical room door, had not sat beside her rather than across from her in the one shared moment of informality the house afforded, when the drawing-room fire was lit on cold evenings, and they existed in the same space for an hour before she made her excuses with perfect courtesy and went upstairs. She always made her excuses first. He had noticed that too. He told himself he was being careful. He told himself that to reach toward her would be to complicate an arrangement that was, by the standards of such arrangements, functioning adequately. He told himself he was protecting both of them from an entanglement that could only become messy. He was lying to himself. He had known it for weeks. What he was actually doing was waiting, in the peculiar paralyzed way of a man who has never had to reach for anything and therefore does not know how, for some signal from her that reaching would not be a mistake. And Lila Carrington, who had spent her whole life being told her preferences were inconvenient, had become so expert at concealing them that she gave no such signal. So they circled each other in the beautiful cold house, both of them wanting something neither of them said, and the weeks folded into one another, and Cashion watched and filed things away. Chapter 3.
She should have been in bed.
She had been going to bed, had changed out of her dinner clothes, had unpinned her hair, had even drawn back the coverlet with the decisive movements of a woman who had decided she was done with the day. And then she had stood there in the dark room with the coverlet turned back and been completely, pointlessly awake, her mind running back over something that had happened at dinner that had not been dramatic enough to justify how long she was thinking about it. He had laughed at something she said. Not a polite laugh, not the social noise a man makes to indicate he has received your comment, and it was adequate. An actual laugh, surprised out of him, there and gone in a second, quickly suppressed, but for that one unguarded second his whole face had changed, and she had seen it, and then it was gone. He had looked down at his plate, and she had looked at hers, and they had both pretended that his expression had not, for one brief moment, looked like the man she had seen through the kitchen doorway with Agnes the cook. That was what she was thinking about at midnight in her darkened room. She put her shoes back on. She told herself she was going to the library. The botanical rooms sometimes helped when her mind was running. The smell of old paper, the particular silence of a room full of things that had already said everything they had to say. The corridor to the library took her past the study. She was not thinking about the study. She was thinking about the botanical rooms and the letters, and the way the rose classification argument ended, which she had not yet reached in the correspondence because she'd been saving it. She was not listening for anything. She heard the laughter before she was level with the door. It stopped her. Entirely. Her hand came up without her instructing it to, the gesture of someone who has heard a sound they need to locate, and then she was standing 6 inches from the study door, which was not fully closed, the laughter still ringing slightly in the air around it. Dorian's laughter. She recognized it because she had only heard it twice before, the kitchen and the brief, unguarded second at dinner tonight, and she knew its quality now. Genuine, low, the sound of a man who is nowhere near performing. She raised her hand to knock.
She was going to knock.
Then she heard Cashion's voice, warm and conspiratorial and intimate in the way that voices get at midnight when the estate is quiet. You can't tell me the arrangement is working. She follows you around hoping you'll finally notice her. It's almost sad. The hand she'd raised went still. There was a pause. And then Dorian's voice, easy, unhesitating, the voice of a man saying something that required no thought because it was simply true. Lila's here because the families needed a resolution. That's all this is. She did not hear the rest of it. She had already taken a step back, then another, walking backward down the corridor the way you back away from something you are not sure is safe, and then she turned and she walked. Not fast. Lila Carrington did not run. Running would have been undignified, and dignity was the one thing she had not yet surrendered, and did not intend to. She walked at a measured pace through the dark corridor and up the stairs and down the passage to her room, and she closed the door behind her with the deliberate quiet of a person who is not going to make a sound. She sat on the edge of the bed. She had known. That was the thing sitting in the center of her chest like a stone. The knowledge that she had known since the carriage ride, had told herself over and over in the botanical rooms and at dinner and in the garden. She had told herself, it is an arrangement. She had made herself not hope. And then she had hoped anyway. Of course she had. Because he laughed at something she said, and his face had changed, and she had filed it away in her careful private archive and taken it out and turned it over in the dark. Confirmation of what she already knew shouldn't feel like this. But it did. It felt like the floor going out. She did not cry. She was aware that this was strange, that a woman who had just had her quiet, careful hope confirmed as foolish should perhaps cry, should be permitted that, but the tears did not arrive, and she understood after a few minutes that they were not going to. What came instead was something colder and more precise. Clarity. She stood up. She went to the wardrobe. The gowns were beautiful. He had chosen them. Mrs. Holt had told her, early on, that the clothing was selected from a list of measurements the family solicitors had forwarded, and they were exactly the right colors for her coloring and the right styles for the estate's formality, and she had worn them dutifully and never once felt like herself in any of them. She looked at them now with the detached attention of a woman taking an inventory. The jewels were in a fitted case on the dressing table. She opened it and looked at them. There was a note tucked beneath the velvet tray that she had been given upon arrival and had since memorized, despite herself, because it was the most personal thing he had ever written to her. These were my mother's. I hope you'll find occasions to wear them.
Diffie.
She looked at it for a long time. Then she set it face down. She closed the jewel case. She closed the wardrobe. She went to her writing desk and she sat and she thought, not emotionally but practically, the way she had always thought through the things that hurt most, reducing them to a series of questions with answers. What did she actually have? What did she actually need? Where could she go? She had a small purse of her own money, savings accumulated since girlhood, always portable, always kept against the possibility of needing to leave somewhere. She had the clothes she had arrived in. She had, in the inner pocket of her traveling coat, a small thing that belonged to no one else in this house, a brass compass that had been her brother's, given to her when he went to sea, the needle pointing faithfully north as it always did, worn smooth from years of her thumb. She had everything that was hers. Everything else had always been borrowed. She did not sleep. She sat with her coat across her lap and she waited for the particular gray light that comes before dawn, when the world is not yet day, but has decided to be. And when it came, she rose and she put on her own clothes and she put the compass in her pocket and she walked out. Not through the servants' entrance, not through any side door. She walked through the entrance hall, under the chandelier that had not been lit at this hour, past the vase of white flowers that had been replaced with new ones 3 days ago. White again, Mrs. Holt's faithful choice, and out through the main door, and down the stone steps, and across the cobblestone drive. She did not look back at the house. This was not bravery. Bravery would have been staying. This was something simpler and more necessary. The decision of a woman who had finally run out of reasons to wait for someone to choose her. She would choose herself instead. The dawn light caught the cobblestones as she reached the gate, turning them blue-gray and faintly luminous, and she walked through it, and she did not stop walking, and the great house stood behind her in the morning quiet with every light still out, and every door still closed, and Dorian Vale still asleep in his room with no idea that the floor was about to go out from under him too. Chapter 4. He knew before he was fully awake. There was a quality to the morning. Not the light, not any sound, but something atmospheric and wrong, a missing note in the chord of the house, and he lay in the dark with his eyes open for a moment before understanding what it was. The estate was a place he knew at cellular level, every sound and silence catalogued by 30 years of familiarity. He could tell when a window had been left unlatched in the east wing by the particular pitch of the air moving through the corridor. He could tell when Mrs. Holt had rearranged something in the entrance hall by the changed echo of his own footsteps. He could tell, lying in the pre-dawn stillness, that something with weight had left. He sat up. He dressed without thinking about it, the automatic motions of a man who has trained himself out of hesitation, and he moved through the upper corridor to her rooms without any plan forming in his mind, which was itself strange, because Dorian Vale always had a plan. He knocked. He waited. He opened the door. The room was exactly as it had been arranged for her arrival. The gowns were in the wardrobe. The jewel case was on the dressing table. The bed had been slept in. The coverlet was folded back, the pillow slightly dented, but she was not there, and the room had the specific quality of a space that a person has finished with. Not vacated in haste. Finished with deliberately. He went downstairs. He checked the garden. He checked the library. He checked the botanical rooms and stood in the doorway and saw the stack of unfinished letters on the table beside the window. She'd left them mid-sequence, a letter half unfolded, as though she'd set them down in the middle of a sitting and intended to return, and something about the incompleteness of it was harder to look at than the empty room had been. He found a footman. "Miss Carrington," he said, and his voice was level because his voice was always level. "When did you last see her?" The footman looked at him with the careful expression of someone delivering information they know will not be well received. "Before dawn, sir. I was coming in from the night watch." She walked out through the main gate. A pause. "No bag, sir." Nothing in her hands. Nothing in her hands. He stood in the entrance hall for a moment. He looked at the white flowers in the vase, fresh 3 days ago, just beginning to open now. He remembered her saying, "They chose something that suits the light in here." The most personal exchange they had managed in 11 weeks of living in the same house, and it had been about flowers. He went to her writing desk. There was no note. He had not truly expected one. A woman who left with nothing in her hands did not leave notes, because a note would have required her to explain herself, and she owed him no explanation, but the absence of it landed strangely. A note would have been something to hold. A note would have given him a direction. He found the face-down piece of paper on the desk. He turned it over. His own handwriting looked back at him. "These were my mother's. I hope you'll find occasions to wear them."
Divvy.
He read it. He read it the way he suspected she had read it, several times over, trying to find more in it than was there, and he understood, with the horrible clarity that comes too late, exactly what it had sounded like. Not warmth. Not an offering. A transaction. "Here is an object. I hope you will use it appropriately." He set it back down. He stood in the room for a long time. Cashion arrived at 9, as he always did. He appeared in the study doorway with coffee and correspondence and the composed face of a man who had not yet been told anything, and then he took in Dorian's expression and went still.
"She's gone," Dorian said.
Cashion was quiet for a moment. Then, "Gone where?" "Out the front gate before dawn."
"No back."
"No note." He paused. "Nothing." Cashion set the coffee down carefully and settled into the chair across the desk, and his face arranged itself into the expression of a man being reasonable about an unreasonable situation. "These things happen," he said. "The arrangement was always going to require negotiation. The family's will."
"Don't," Dorian said.
Not loudly, not harshly. Simply with the flatness of a word placed between them like a physical object. Cashion stopped. "Don't tell me the families will handle it," Dorian said. "Don't tell me it will look desperate to go after her. Don't tell me what this looks like from the outside, Cashion, because I am not interested in the outside of it right now." Cashion studied him. Something moved in his expression, too quick to name, and then it was gone, replaced by the smooth attentiveness of a man listening carefully. "What are you going to do?" he asked. Dorian looked at him. He had known Cashion since they were boys. 23 years of shared history, of Cashion in that chair, Cashion with the coffee, Cashion the first person at the door with a solution and a composed face, whenever something went wrong. He looked at him now and felt something he could not quite name, a slight miscalibration, as though something he had been using as a fixed point had shifted an inch without his noticing. He filed the feeling away. "Give me the estate accounts for this week," he said, "and then give me the room." He spent the morning doing what he always did when something was wrong: working. He moved through the estate's accounts, responded to 3 urgent correspondences, held a meeting with the steward about the northern boundary issue that had been outstanding for a month. He was thorough and precise and made all the right decisions and understood none of them. At noon, he went back to her room. He stood in the doorway the way he had stood in the botanical room doorway, the door at its original position, not entering the space. He looked at the wardrobe. He thought about the gowns in there, the specific colors he had chosen, not from a list, despite what he had told himself, but from his own knowledge of what would suit her, formed over weeks of watching her from a careful distance. He had chosen them himself. He had spent an afternoon on it. He had told the house solicitor they were selected from a standard list for an arranged household, because to admit otherwise would have been to admit something he was not ready to say. She was here because the families needed a resolution. That's all this is. He heard his own voice saying it. He heard how it had sounded in the study, comfortable and easy and careless, the voice of a man who did not have to think about it. He heard it the way she must have heard it, standing outside that door. He had said one true thing in that conversation, after she had already walked away. He had said, "Don't talk about her like that again." She had not heard it. He thought about that for a long time. Then he changed his coat, told Mrs. Holt he would be away from the estate, and left without telling Cashion where he was going.
Chapter 5.
The town was called Wren's Mill, and it smelled of bread and river water, and the particular dusty warmth of a market day winding down. Lila had not chosen it. She had walked until a coaching and appeared on the roadside, and had taken a room with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had done this before, which she had not, but she had watched enough people do it that she could perform competence with her eyes closed. The room was small and clean, and had a window that looked out at an ordinary street with ordinary people moving through it, and she sat in the chair beside it for a long time with her coat still on and her brass compass in her palm, and felt nothing. Or rather, she felt everything, but at a distance. As though the events of the last several hours were taking place on the other side of glass, visible, detailed, technically real, but not yet touching her. She recognized this as the state she went into when things were very bad. A buffer. Her body's way of giving her mind time to arrange things before the full weight arrived. She was waiting for relief. She had expected relief. It did not come. The inn's common room was busy at midday. Lila came downstairs because staying in the room had begun to feel like waiting for a verdict, and she was tired of waiting for things. She ordered tea she didn't want and sat in a corner and watched the room with the habits of a woman who had learned early that watching was safer than participating. She noticed the woman at the table near the fire. She was perhaps 60, broad and settled in her chair the way people become when they have decided they are done apologizing for taking up space. She was eating alone and reading a small leather book and eating efficiently, with the manner of someone who enjoys a meal and does not feel she requires company to justify enjoying it. She looked, Lila thought, entirely at ease with herself, and there was something about this that was at once comforting and quietly devastating. The woman looked up and caught Lila looking, and instead of looking away did the thing older women with that particular quality of settledness sometimes did. She smiled, directly and without any performance, the smile of a person who simply sees no reason not to. "Passing through?" she asked. Her voice was mild and unhurried. Yes, said Lila. Then, because the word felt like a lie, I'm not entirely sure where to. The woman considered this without any sign of finding it unusual. That's more honest than most people manage, she said. She closed her book. Sit here if you like. I find midday better with company, but only if the company is quiet. Lila moved to the table. The woman's name was Margaret, and she was a widower 3 years over and returning from visiting her daughter's new household. She did not ask Lila anything directly. She talked instead, in the unhurried way of someone filling a room with something pleasant, about her daughter's husband, about the particular challenges of watching someone you love navigate the first year of a marriage. The problem with the first year, Margaret said, stirring her tea with the focused attention of someone making sure she gets this right, is that both people are performing. Not lying, performing. Showing the best version, the most patient version. And the other person is doing the same, so you end up with two best versions circling each other very politely and never actually meeting. Lila looked at her. And then, Margaret continued, something cracks. Some moment where one of them is too tired to perform, or too hurt, or too angry. And instead of being a disaster, it's actually the first real thing that happens between them. Because it's the first time the other person sees who they actually are. She picked up her tea. She looked at Lila over the rim with the mild gaze of a woman who is not making a point, merely reporting an observation. My husband and I, our first real conversation happened in a row about a gate latch. 3 months in. Before that, we'd been terribly well behaved with each other. A small smile. I miss him every day. Lila looked at the fire. Forgive me, Margaret said. I've been talking at you. No, Lila said. And then, because it was true, it was exactly the right thing to hear. She went back to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and let the full weight arrive. It arrived the way she had known it would, not as tears, not as drama, but as the slow and absolute understanding that she had left something she cared about. Not the house, not the arrangement, not the title, not any of the formal structures she had spent 11 weeks navigating. She had left a man who had, in small increments and without apparent intention, become someone she thought about constantly. A man whose face she had been studying like a text she needed to translate. Whose rare, unguarded moments she had collected in her private archive with a precision that, in this small room with the ordinary street outside the window, felt less like wisdom and more like evidence. She took the compass out of her pocket. Her brother had given it to her the morning he left for sea. Pressed it into her hand without ceremony, said only, in case you need to find north. He had been 18 and she had been 15 and she had been furious about him leaving and had not said so and had kept the compass instead. She had kept it because north is fixed. Because when everything else is uncertain, north does not change its mind. She looked at the needle and she thought about Margaret's voice, a row about a gate latch, and she thought about a man who had followed her out to the garden at night and told her the east gate was unlocked, and she thought about his face in the 1 second before he remembered to close it again. She did not know what to do with any of it. She was free, and she had no idea what to do with that. She was right to have left, and she was not, in any clean or comfortable way, relieved to have done it. She was thinking about this, turning the compass over in her hands, watching the needle find north again and again no matter how she tilted it, when she heard, from the direction of the inn's courtyard below her window, the sound of a horse arriving at speed. She did not look out the window. She looked at the compass. The needle held steady. North was north, wherever she was. She was still deciding what that meant when the knock came at her door. Chapter 6. He had taken a horse rather than a carriage because a carriage required a coachman, and he was not prepared to explain where he was going to anyone who would later tell Cashion. That thought, the deliberate concealment of his movements from a man he had trusted for 23 years, arrived with a clarity that surprised him. He filed it beside the other miscalibration from the morning and road. He was not a man who chased things. This was a fact about himself he had accepted long ago, the way you accept the architectural features of a house you were born in, not with pleasure, exactly, but with the pragmatic understanding that the walls are where they are, and working around them is more efficient than pretending otherwise. He sent people. He arranged things. He managed outcomes from a position of deliberate distance, and the outcomes were managed, and the distance was maintained. This system had served him adequately for 34 years. He had been writing for 20 minutes when he admitted to himself that he had no plan. He tried to construct one. He was good at that, at running scenarios, at anticipating variables, at mapping the most efficient path between a problem and its resolution. He had done it every day of his professional life with a facility that had made him, he knew, genuinely formidable. He turned his mind to the problem of Lila Carrington in the same way and found, immediately, that it did not work.
He had no speech.
Every version he rehearsed fell apart in under 30 seconds. Not because the words were wrong, he could find the right words, he was not inarticulate, but because he understood, with humiliating precision, that the situation required something other than words. It required an admission. He had spent his entire adult life constructing himself as a man who did not need to admit things, and the construction had been so thorough and so load-bearing that he genuinely did not know how to dismantle it. He thought about what she had looked like in the botanical room. Cross-legged on the floor, shoes off, a letter in her lap, and that small involuntary smile every time the language got precise. He thought about the garden, the way she had asked about the flowers, which had not been a question about flowers at all but an offering, a small, careful opening in an otherwise defended position, an invitation to be a person rather than a role. He had responded with 4 sentences and gone inside. He understood now with the exhausting clarity of retrospect, absolutely terrible at this. He stopped at the first and along the post road. Not because he had information. He had nothing but a direction and the gate guard's account of which road she'd taken, but because it was the kind of place a woman traveling alone with nothing would stop. The innkeeper was a practical man who answered questions without embellishment. A young woman, auburn hair, ivory, yes. Early this morning. Took a room, came down for midday. Still here as far as he knew. Something shifted in Dorian's chest. He did not examine it. "Don't announce me," he said. "Which room?" The innkeeper's eyes moved briefly to Dorian's coat. Good cut, good cloth, the coat of a man accustomed to being obliged, and back. "Top of the stairs," he said. "Second door." Dorian took the stairs. He stood at the second door for a moment, long enough to be aware that his heartbeat had become something he could feel in his throat, which was new, and then he knocked. Silence. Then, "Who is it?" He had not thought about this part. He had been so focused on finding her that the finding had felt like the destination rather than the beginning of something. He stood at the door and understood that he was now required to speak, and that nothing he said through a closed door was going to be adequate, and that he was going to say it anyway. "It's Dorian," he said. He paused.
Vale. Dorian Vale. He stopped.
He was aware that adding his surname to his own first name was not, by any standard, an eloquent beginning. A longer silence. Then the sound of a chair. The door opened. She stood in the frame with her coat still on, and her hair loose from its arrangement, and the brass compass visible in her left hand. She looked at him with the expression he had come to think of as her assessment face, reading him, cataloging, not giving anything away, and for a moment neither of them said anything. He had ridden 20 miles in under 2 hours, and he had no speech, and he was standing in the corridor of a roadside inn with his carefully constructed distance in pieces around him, and there was nothing left to do but tell the truth. "I want to tell you what I actually said," he said. "All of it, not just the part you heard." She looked at him for a long moment. "You don't have to justify." "I know I don't have to." Something in his voice changed, not harder, but more exposed, the difference between controlled and simply direct. "I want to, because what you heard was true, and it was also not complete, and the part that was missing matters to me more than I understood until this morning." She was still in the doorway. She had not stepped back to let him in. She had not closed the door. She was simply standing there with the compass in her hand and her face very still, in the posture of a woman who has been waiting for something she stopped letting herself want. "And," he said, "because he had started and could not stop now, because I followed you out to the garden that night and told you about a gate and went back inside before you could say anything, and I have been doing the equivalent of that for 11 weeks, and it needs to stop." She looked at him for another moment. "You said your own surname," she said. "I know."
Dorian Vale.
"You announced yourself with your own surname." The corner of his mouth moved, just slightly. "I was nervous." Something shifted in her face, the most minute softening, there and gone. And then she stepped back from the door and said, "Come in then."
He came in.
He did not look at the room, did not take inventory of the small bed, the plain chair, the window onto the ordinary street, the modest simplicity of a room she had chosen because it was the first available and because she had arrived with nothing. He looked at her. She sat in the chair. He remained standing, not because he was claiming authority over the space, but because he was too restless to sit, and because she was looking at him with that full direct attention that he had been trying to avoid for 3 months, and he understood now that the avoidance had been its own kind of cruelty.
"Tell me," she said.
"What you actually said." Chapter 7. He told her. But before he got to the end of it, there was a thing he needed to find out, a thread that had been pulling at the back of his mind since the morning, since the footman's face, since the way Cashion had arrived at 9 with coffee and composed sympathy just a degree too smooth. "I need to ask you something first," he said. "The things Cashion has said to you, about the arrangement, about what he thought of it." He watched her face carefully. "What did he tell you?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, "He told me you were well-suited, that you needed someone settled, that the arrangement was straightforward." A pause. He said it the way people say things that are meant to sound like compliments, but land differently. Dorian went still. He thought about a stable hand named William who had found him in the east courtyard 2 hours after Lila left. William, who overheard things because William was always in the wrong place at the right time and had never learned to pretend otherwise. Who had come to him with his hat in his hands and his face troubled and said, "I heard something last week, sir, in Mr. Cashion's study. I probably wasn't meant to." Dorian had listened, and several things that had been floating separately in his mind had, with quiet and devastating precision, connected. "I need to show you something," he said. "When we get back." She looked at him. "When we get back," she repeated. Not a question. "I'm asking," he said. "Not telling. Not arranging. I'm asking you to come back with me. Not because the arrangement requires it. Because I am asking." Outside the window, the ordinary street moved past in the gray afternoon. She turned the compass over once in her hand. The needle found north. "Tell me what you said," she said again. All of it. Then I'll decide. He told her. He told her from the beginning, not from the beginning of the conversation in the study, but from the beginning of the evening, which meant the dinner, which meant explaining why he had laughed. It had been something she said about the estate's east wing looking in the firelight like a face trying to decide whether to be frightening, and it had surprised a laugh out of him before he could stop it. He had spent the rest of the meal managing his expression and had apparently managed it too well. You looked away immediately, she said. Yes. I thought you were embarrassed. She paused. That I'd said something strange.
No.
He was quiet for a moment. I wasn't embarrassed. He stopped. Started again. I wasn't expecting it. The way he said it. I wasn't prepared. She looked at him with that direct attention. Prepared for what? For finding you funny. He said it plainly, as though it were simply a fact to be reported, which it was. For finding you. Another stop. For any of it. She didn't say anything. She was holding the compass loosely now, turning it once, and he watched her do it and thought, this is the most honest conversation I have had in years. Perhaps ever. He understood this was a damning statement about his years. He told her what Cashion had said. He used the exact words because she deserved the exact words. She follows you around hoping you'll finally notice her. It's almost sad. Something in her face contracted at that. Small, controlled, quickly recovered, but he had been watching her face for 3 months with more attention than he'd given most things in his life, and he saw it. And you said, she said, what you said. I said, Lila's here because the families needed a resolution. That's all this is. He held her gaze. I said it because Cashion was watching me, because he had just described you in a way that made me want to, and I didn't. I used indifference as a cover. A cover for what? The sentence sat between them. He had come this far. For caring about you, he said, which I had been doing for approximately 10 weeks and had told myself very firmly was irrelevant. She looked at him for a long time. He let her. And then he said, after you'd gone, after you were already walking back down that corridor, I said, don't talk about her like that again. She was very still. I know you didn't hear it, he said. I'm not telling you because it makes what I said before it less damaging. It doesn't. I'm telling you because it's the truest thing I said that night, and you've only had the untrue part, and that's not fair. She stood up from the chair. She moved to the window and stood with her back to him for a moment, looking out at the ordinary street, and he waited because he had learned, finally, that waiting was what the moment required. I need to tell you something, she said. Her voice was even. She had always had a voice like that, level and clear, the voice of someone who had long ago decided that whatever she felt, she would say it without begging to be received. I knew. When I arrived, I told myself it was an arrangement. I told myself to keep it functional. I told myself not to hope. A pause. And then you followed me into the garden and told me the east gate was unlocked, and I stood there after you went in and thought. He noticed. He noticed I needed to walk further, and he came out and told me. And I told myself that meant nothing. He was very still. It meant something, she said. She turned. And that's the worst part of this. Not that you said what you said, but that I had been collecting evidence for 11 weeks that it meant something, and one sentence through a half-open door dismantled all of it. She looked at him steadily. I don't know what to do with the evidence I collected and the sentence I heard both being true. They can't both be true. They're both true, he said. That's exactly the problem. She looked at him. And then, for the first time since he had knocked on her door, something in her expression came undone. Not dramatically, not in tears, but in the way a sentence is sometimes completed by something you hadn't expected, and the unexpected completion turns out to be the right one. I said the true thing too late, she said. When I went back inside, I had decided to come to you the night I overheard. I had decided, standing in the garden, that I was going to knock on that door and say something honest for once. And then I heard what I heard, and she stopped. I had been waiting to be chosen, and I finally stopped waiting. I should have chosen you loudly enough for you to hear it, he said. I should have chosen you before Cashion could make it into a weapon. Cashion. The name in the room changed something. Tell me, she said, what he did. He told her about William. The stable hand had overheard Cashion speaking to someone, a legal representative, from the phrasing, about conditions in the estate's inheritance. A clause in the original title that the family's solicitors had apparently buried. In the event of the arrangement failing to produce an heir within a set term, guardianship of the estate would pass to the named advisor. Cashion had known about this clause for years. Had known about it while he counseled Dorian toward distance. Had known about it while he arrived in the study doorway with coffee and managed observations and the smoothly composed face of a man with no stake in the outcome. Lila listened to all of it without speaking. He engineered the conversation, Dorian said. That night. The question he asked me, you can't tell me the arrangement is working. He had done something, I think, to make sure the study door was unlatched. He needed you to hear a specific thing without context. And you gave it to him, she said. Not as accusation, as fact. And I gave it to him. He met her eyes. Because I was playing a role I'd been playing so long, I didn't notice I was playing it. And you were standing on the other side of the door, and I had no idea. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he told me, twice, that you found the arrangement convenient, that you appreciated how undemanding I was. A pause. I thought that was a kind way of saying you didn't notice me. He was making sure you stayed convinced of that. Yes, she said. He was rather good at it. She looked at him, fully, clearly, with all the directness she had been keeping in careful check for 3 months. I still have to decide, she said. I want you to know that. The truth about Cashion changes something, but it doesn't change everything. You still said what you said. I know. And you were still, she paused, very much in that house with me for 11 weeks and said almost nothing true. I know. And the East Gate. And the flowers. And every small thing you did that I convinced myself meant nothing when it meant something. Her voice was even, but her jaw was set, and she was holding the compass hard now. And he understood she was angry, and understood with precise and humbling clarity that she was entitled to be. I know, he said for the 3rd time. And then, I know, and I am asking you to come back. Not because the situation is resolved or the arrangements are intact or anything external to you and me. I'm asking because I want to try to be the person who says the true thing loudly enough for you to hear it. Because you deserve that. She looked at him for a long time. Then, I need to hear you say it, she said. Not around it. Not the version that sounds like it. The actual thing. He understood what she was asking. He had been circling it for 11 weeks. I care about you, he said. Not performed. Not constructed. Plain, the way only the true things are. Not as a resolution. Not as an arrangement. I care about you, and I have been afraid of that, and I handled it very badly. She looked at the compass. She looked at him. All right, she said, finally. Take me back. He exhaled, not loudly, but she heard it. She had always heard everything. And Dorian, she said. She looked up at him with the clear brown eyes that had been cataloging him for months. When we get there, I'm going to have a question for Cashion that I'd like you to let me ask. Yes, he said. He did not ask what the question was. He was, he suspected, about to discover that Lila Carrington was considerably more formidable than he had understood. Chapter 8. They rode back in the last of the afternoon light, not side by side, because the road was narrow, but close enough that the sound of two horses moving together made a different rhythm than the sound of one. He had thought, before he found her, that returning to the estate would feel like resolution, an outcome managed, the situation contained. He understood now that what was happening was not containment, but exposure. The long process of dismantling the version of himself that had kept everyone, including the woman riding a length behind him, at the precise distance required to feel safe. He was not sure what was on the other side of that dismantling. He had been too busy constructing it to think about what happened if it came down. Cashion was in the drawing room when they arrived. He stood when he heard them come in, and Dorian watched his face make its adjustments with the practiced speed of a man who had been doing it for years. The brief, unguarded moment, surprise at seeing Lila, something calculating passing behind it, then the smooth reassembly into warmth, lasted perhaps 3 seconds. 3 seconds was enough. You found her, Cashion said. His voice was warm and carefully relieved. Thank God. We were worried. Were you? Dorian said. Not a question. Something shifted in Cashion's expression. The adjustment was good. It was always good. Dorian had been watching it for 20 years and had never once read it as performance, but he was reading it differently now. He was reading it knowing what he was looking for. Sit down, Dorian said. Both of you. What followed was not a dramatic confrontation. That, Dorian thought, might have been easier to navigate. Drama had the shape of performance to it. The raised voices, the accusations hurled, the villain explaining himself at length. What happened instead was quiet and methodical and 3 times more devastating, because quiet and methodical was the language Cashion understood, and having it turned against him left him nowhere to perform. Dorian laid out what William had overheard. He did not embellish. He gave dates, overheard phrases. The name of the legal representative Cashion had been meeting in the East Annex on Tuesday afternoons for the past 4 months. He watched Cashion's face as each item was produced, the slight tightening around the eyes, the fractional recalibration of posture, the smooth effort to maintain the warmth of expression even as the content beneath it was being surgically removed. Cashion denied the first item, reframed the second. By the third, he had moved to justification. The clause existed. The estate was his primary concern. He had simply been ensuring appropriate contingencies were in place. Surely Dorian could see. You knew what she was to me, Dorian said, before I did. Cashion stopped. You saw it before I named it to myself. And you used that. He held Cashion's gaze steadily. You made sure I would say the exact wrong thing in the exact right place. You needed her to leave. Cashion's face was, for the first time in 20 years, entirely without its management. He looked under it, like a man who had made a decision a long time ago that had seemed reasonable at the time, and had not understood until this moment that it was not. Dorian. The question, said Lila, is not why you did it. Both men turned. She was sitting with her coat still on, and her compass in her pocket, and her hands folded in her lap, and she was looking at Cashion with the direct, unhurried attention she brought to everything she needed to understand. The question, she said, in the clear, even voice of a woman who has been listening carefully to everything and is now going to speak, is whether you told him other things. Before the conversation, I overheard. Whether the distance between us was natural or whether it was managed. The silence was very long. Cashion looked at Lila. He looked at Dorian. He was doing Dorian could see a final calculation, determining what version of the truth would preserve the most. It was the calculation of a man who had been calculating for so long that he no longer knew how to simply answer a question. And then, because Lila was looking at him with the expression of a woman who would simply wait indefinitely for the actual answer, he answered,
Yes.
He had mentioned on 3 separate occasions in Dorian's first weeks with Lila that she seemed content with the arrangement's formality, that she appreciated the distance, that she had told Mrs. Holt she found the house manageable, which was not what she had said. She had said it was beautiful, and which had been designed to suggest to Dorian that Lila regarded it as a functional residence rather than a potential home. He had redirected Dorian's attention, twice, away from things that had caught it. He had framed her quiet as absence of feeling rather than its opposite. He delivered all of this in the measured voice of a man making a confession he has decided to control the shape of, and when he was done he looked at Dorian and said, I believed I was protecting the estate.
From what? Dorian said.
Cashion did not answer that. He didn't need to. The answer was, from you choosing her. From you choosing her freely and well and without hesitation, because that was the version of Dorian Vale, the man capable of that did not need Cashion as a managed safeguard. That made Cashion, instead of indispensable, simply someone who had been there for a long time. Dorian had him removed from the estate that evening. Not loudly. The necessary arrangements were made with the estate's solicitor the following morning. The legal clause was contested and would take time, but the clause, Dorian told his own legal representative, did not matter because the arrangement had not failed. The arrangement was intact. More than intact. He said this standing in the solicitor's office with Lila beside him, and he said it with the particular steadiness of a man who was saying something he meant. The solicitor wrote it down. Dorian looked at Lila. She was looking at the solicitor's handwriting with an expression he was beginning to learn, the expression she wore when something real had happened, and she was calibrating how real it was allowed to be. He did not reach for her hand. They were not there yet. There was still the chapter of repair, the slower, less dramatic work of building something real in the place where the performance had been. But he stood beside her, close enough that she could feel he was there. She did not move away. Chapter 9. The estate was quieter. Not the performing quiet it had been before, the careful silence of a house on its best behavior, every surface maintained in the specific way of places where the people living in them are trying not to take up too much space. This was different. This was the quiet of a house that had been holding its breath for some time and had, with a long exhale, stopped. Lila noticed at the moment she came downstairs in the morning and found the entrance hall simply empty, no assembled staff. No formal arrangement of people waiting to be observed performing their function. Just the hallway, the flowers, white, always white, Mrs. Holt's faithful signature, the chandelier dark in the morning light. No footman materializing from a corner. No sense of an audience. She stood in the entrance hall in her own clothes, not the gowns, not yet, and the house felt, for the first time, like somewhere a person could simply be. She found Dorian in the library. Not in the botanical rooms, in the main library, in the first large room with the serious shelves, standing at the window with a cup of coffee that had clearly been there long enough to go cold. He was reading something. He did not hear her come in. She watched him for a moment, the way she had watched him for months, the careful archiving. But differently now. Before, she had been collecting evidence, filing things under. This might mean something. Cross-referencing against, but it probably doesn't. running the same calculation over and over, and arriving at the same careful negative. She was watching him now simply because he was there, and she was here, and watching was what she was doing. He looked different in the library, less constructed than he did in the study or at the dinner table. The architecture of authority less visible, something beneath it more accessible. He was wearing a dark shirt with the sleeves pushed back, and he was frowning slightly at the page in the way that meant he was working something through, and the cold coffee beside him suggested he had forgotten about it in the way people forgot about things when something else had their attention. She knocked on the open door. He looked up. The slight adjustment she had observed so many times, the rapid reassembly of the composed face, began and then stopped. It stopped because he caught himself in it, and she saw him catch himself, and he let it go. What remained was simply his face, looking at her.
"Good morning," she said.
"Good morning." He set the book down. "Have you eaten?" "Not yet." She came in. She did not take his habitual chair, the one across the desk that Cashion had occupied. She took the window seat, which was wide and cushioned and full of morning light, and pulled her feet up. He watched her do this with the expression she was coming to identify as, "He is thinking something he is deciding whether to say." "I've been reading my grandmother's letters," he said. She looked at him. "The Rose classification ones?" "The Rose classification ones." Something in his face, very small, the ghost of the kitchen laugh. She was right about all three, and she absolutely knew it, and she gave everyone involved a comprehensive scientific dressing down without ever once losing her manners. A pause. "It's the most alive thing in this house," Lila said. "Yes." They stayed in the library for 2 hours. It was the longest uninterrupted time they had spent in the same space without the formality of dinner or the performance of the estate's social architecture, and it was nothing like what Lila had imagined such a thing would feel like. She had imagined, in the small private space of her hopeful imagination, which she had kept rigorously hidden, that it would feel like an event, something significant and declared. Instead, it felt like weather, easy and ambient and natural, the way the right temperature feels. Not remarkable because it is extreme, but because it is simply correct. He told her about the estate. Not the formal history. She had read all the formal histories in the first fortnight, but the actual history, the one made of particular afternoons rather than dates. He told her about a room in the East Wing that flooded every heavy rain because someone in the previous century had made a poor architectural decision, and the subsequent generations had addressed it by simply never using the room. He told her about the North Garden, which was not the garden she'd been using, and which was different from the South, wilder, less maintained, the one his mother had actually walked in. She told him about her brother. She told him about the compass, the morning he had pressed it into her hand at the dock, and the fury she'd felt, and the way she had not said so, and had kept the compass instead, and had been turning it over in her hands ever since whenever things were bad. "You could have put it down," he said. "At some point." "I know." She looked at it in her palm. "But then I'd have had to feel the thing underneath it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What is the thing underneath it?" She looked at him steadily. "That he's been gone for 8 years, and I still look for him in rooms." He did not say, "I'm sorry." He did not say anything that was a response-shaped noise rather than an actual response. He looked at her with the careful, thorough attention she had catalogued from across a dinner table for months, and said, "What was he like?" She told him. At noon, Mrs. Holt appeared in the doorway with lunch on a tray and the expression of a woman who had seen many things in 20 years and was exercising professional discretion about what she thought of this one. She set the tray on the window seat beside Lila without comment, gave Dorian a look that contained multitudes, and left. Lila looked at the tray. She looked at Dorian. "Does she do that often?" she asked. "Bring lunch to the library?" "She has never done that once in my life," he said. Lila looked back at the door through which Mrs. Holt had departed. She thought about Agnes in the kitchen doorway, the fond exasperation of someone who had known him since boyhood. She thought about the house, this beautiful, cold, honest house, and the people in it who had been watching this particular situation with a quiet, rooting interest of people who wanted a good outcome and had not been certain they would get one. "I think," she said, "that your staff are rooting for us." "I think you're right," he said. He looked at her with the expression she had not had a name for until this morning.
She had a name for it now.
"I am also rooting for us, if that's useful information." She looked at him for a moment. "Then, it is." After a while, she asked the question she had been carrying since the inn, the one she had known she would ask when the time was right, and had been patient enough to wait for the right time. "Why did you tell Cashion not to talk about me like that?" she said. "That night, after what you'd said." He was very still. He had known this question was coming. She could tell he had prepared himself for it, not rehearsed it, but prepared the way you prepare for something that deserves to be said carefully. "Because you're not a subject of conversation," he said. "You're mine to protect." She held his gaze. "I'd rather be yours to choose." Something moved across his face, the full weight of 3 months of collected evidence landing, finally, with nowhere left to deflect. "That too," he said. "That too." Chapter 10. The North Garden was different from the South. She had known this since Dorian told her about it in the library. The wilder one, the less maintained one, the one his mother had actually walked in, and she had been meaning to find it and had not, partly because the South Garden had become hers in the way that corners of places become yours when you've done enough private thinking in them, and change requires a kind of readiness she hadn't been sure she had.
She had it now.
The North Garden was reached through a gate in the kitchen wall that she had always assumed led to a service path. It did lead to a service path briefly, and then the service path opened onto an acre of deliberate wilderness, the kind that only looks accidental if you don't know what maintained wilderness looks like. Someone had planted it a long time ago with intention and then left it to grow into its own logic. Climbing roses gone structural, apple trees old enough to be monuments, beds of late-season herbs that had seeded themselves years ago and kept returning without being asked. It smelled of cold earth and the ghost of summer, and in the low November light it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in months. She stood in the middle of it with her wool shawl wrapped close and her breath making small pale shapes in the air and thought, "This is mine." Not because it was given to her, not because any arrangement said so, because she had decided it was. A month had passed since the inn, since the drawing room and Cashion's face coming undone and the library and Mrs. Holt's tray and the particular moment when Dorian had said, "That too." The month had not been easy. She would not have trusted it if it had been easy. Real things were not easy. Real things were made of 100 small renegotiations, the daily work of 2 people who had each spent years perfecting their defenses trying to learn when to put them down. He had knocked on the botanical room door. She had let him in. They had argued about the rose classification. He had sided with one of the dissenting botanists on procedural grounds, and she had found this so infuriating and also so typical that she had laughed in the middle of disagreeing with him, which had made him laugh, and they had spent the next hour reading letters aloud to each other and arguing in the particular enjoyable way of people who are well matched and both know it. He had told her, on a Tuesday evening in the drawing room, that he had not known how to reach for things, that he had been given every material comfort and no language for wanting more than comfort. He had said it the same way he said all the true things, plainly, without embellishment, as though it were simply a fact to be reported, and she had looked at him and understood that it had cost him the same as all the other plain true things, and had not made it smaller. She had told him about the years before the arrangement, the years of being quietly managed out of decisions, of having her preferences noted and then redirected, of learning that her strength lay in her silence because her voice tended to inconvenience people. She had told him this in the garden one morning, and he had listened until she finished, and then said, very carefully, "I want to hear your voice inconvenience me." She had looked at him for a long time before she believed he meant it. She believed it now. The estate had changed. Or rather, she had changed in it, which amounted to the same thing. She moved through it differently now. Not the careful conservation of space of a woman who is a guest, not the maintained composure of someone performing adequacy. She had reorganized the botanical rooms so the correspondence was in chronological order, which it had never been. She had told Mrs. Holt, gently and precisely, that the drawing-room flowers would look better in terracotta. The whites were beautiful, but the room faced west, and in the afternoon wanted warmth. Mrs. Holt had looked at her with the expression she had first catalogued as professional neutrality and had since identified as a kind of deep personal satisfaction, and had appeared the following day with orange dahlias. She had twice disagreed with Dorian in front of the estate solicitor. Both times on technical points where she was right and he had known she was right, and the second time she could see him recognizing it and deciding what to do with that, and he had said, "Lila is correct. The revised approach would be." And they had moved on, and the solicitor had written it down, and later that evening Dorian had looked at her over dinner with the expression she now had a full and confident name for. Not the ghost of the kitchen laugh, not the controlled suppression, but the actual thing, the look he wore when she had done something that delighted him, and he was no longer interested in pretending otherwise. She had reached across the table and taken a piece of his bread without asking, and he had let her, and that had been, in its way, as significant as any declaration either of them had made. She was still standing in the north garden when she heard the gate behind her. She did not turn immediately. She had learned to give moments their full weight before she moved on from them. Footsteps across the frost-crisp grass. He came to stand beside her, close, as he had been standing for a month now, in the particular proximity of a person who has stopped managing the distance, and looked out at the wild garden the way she was looking at it. "It's better than the South," she said. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I haven't been in here in years." "Why?" He was quiet for long enough that she turned to look at him. He was looking at the old apple trees with an expression that was private and a little old, the expression of someone revisiting something they had set down a long time ago. "My mother died in November," he said. "When I was 19. This was where she came to think. She looked at the garden. She thought about the brass compass in her pocket. She thought about things we carry for people we have lost, the way we keep on carrying them not because the weight is comfortable, but because setting them down would require us to feel what we have been keeping at arm's length. It's a good garden for thinking," she said. "Yes." He turned to look at her. The full direct look, nothing managed about it. "She would have liked you." She held his gaze. She felt the full weight of that, not sentimentally, but with the honest recognition of what it meant for him to say it. The currency of what it had cost. "Tell me about her," she said. He told her. The garden held them in its wild quiet, the old roses patient on the stone walls, the apple trees still and enormous around them, the cold air soft. She listened to him talk about his mother the way he had listened to her talk about her brother, with the whole-body attention of someone who understands that being trusted with another person's grief is not a small thing, and should not be received as one. When he finished, they stood for a while without speaking. Then he reached for her hand. It was not tentative, not the reaching of a man asking permission, but the reaching of a man who had decided. She felt his fingers close around hers, warm in the cold air, steady in the way that things are steady when they are simply sure. She did not need to decide. She had already decided. She had decided somewhere between the compass and the doorway and the library and the terracotta dahlias and the dinner table and the solicitor's office and all the 100 small renegotiations of a month that was nothing like easy and everything like real. She let him take her hand. She had packed nothing. She had arrived with one traveling case and a borrowed life and a compass pointing north, and she had spent 3 months in the cold, beautiful house watching a man perform his indifference and filing the evidence that it was only performance, and then she had heard the wrong thing through an open door and walked out before dawn with nothing in her hands and not looked back. She had come back with everything. Not the gowns. She'd chosen new ones. In colors she'd selected herself, and the old ones had gone to the village seamstress for alteration for other women who might wear them more easily. Not the jewels exactly, though she wore his mother's necklace on formal evenings now, not because she was told to, but because she had asked Mrs. Holt the story behind it, and the story was worth honoring. Not the formal shape of an arrangement that had been designed by other people for other people's purposes. She had come back with herself, intact and known and chosen. She stood in the north garden in the failing light with Dorian Vale's hand warm around hers, and she thought about the woman she had been on the carriage ride here, shoulders slightly inward, face arranged into composure, telling herself not to hope. She thought about that woman with the particular tenderness of someone who has survived a thing they were not certain they would survive, and come out the other side of it more fully themselves. The compass was still in her pocket.
She would keep it.
But the needle no longer needed to remind her where north was, because she had found it in a more durable way, not in a direction, but in a decision. She was here. She was choosing to be here. Not enduring, not waiting, not performing contentment for an audience that did not deserve it. Here. Chosen. Choosing. The estate's windows began to glow in the early dark, one by one, warm amber against the cold November sky, the house coming into its evening self the way houses do when the people inside them are finally, simply home. The study door, she knew, stood open. The light spilled into an empty corridor. There was nothing to overhear at that threshold anymore. No half-truths staged for a woman standing on the wrong side of a door. No performances for an audience of one. Everything true was being said out loud, in the north garden, in the library, over breakfast that neither of them took alone anymore, in the 100 small and ordinary and irreplaceable moments of two people who had stopped performing themselves and started being themselves. She had packed nothing. She came back with everything.
If you enjoy watching this story, please like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.